Oh hey, didn't see you there. Guess what? Today we're talking about blood flow restriction training, the benefits of it, supposed benefits, drawbacks, when to use it, how to use it, and what it actually is. Let's learn. What's going on, guys? So it's David, we're here with Smart Fitness, and as I already said to you in the intro, we're doing a video on blood flow restriction training. So let's jump right to it. Simply put, what is it? As the board shows, it's using a cuff of some sort to basically restrict blood flow to the veins. So typically, you would want to have some sort of device monitoring it, and that's where the device called the Katsu comes into play. But for those that are not well off and don't want to spend close to about the $300 range, there is other options to cuffing your limbs. You can use a wrist strap or wrap of some sort around your knees, or you can buy just general cuffs and go from there. Typically, when you're using some sort of blood flow restriction based training, you want to have an RPE of 6 to 7, if you want to call it that, in terms of general tightness, of where you can feel the cuff tight, but it's not completely cutting off your circulation. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is where do you actually want to have the cuff. So the limbs itself, you want to typically have it closest to the heart. So if you're doing it for some sort of upper body based training like bicep curls, you would want to have it at the very top of the shoulder, basically just below the GH, or around like the lateral head of the delt, if you want to call it that, the top of the bicep in and of itself. And if you're doing it for lower body based training, typically you would go at the femur level, above the hips, as high up as you can. All right guys, the next thing we want to look at is why do you want to do it? So typically, if you're an injured individual, you can't really train above the 70% range. And as we know, based on general literature and strength and conditioning principles, if you're below that 70% range, typically you're kind of just spinning your wheels, wasting your time. So if you're injured and you're able to tolerate some sort of tissue loading, blood flow restriction training is generally a good idea. Because you're within the ranges that's well below 60%, typically it's around the 30 to 50% range, it is an advantageous way to rehab nagging injuries. At the same time, it can have an increased hypertrophic response. So just from cell swelling in and of itself, it can lead to hypertrophy of a muscle fiber. At the same time, there's going to be an increased metabolic stress response. So when I say metabolic, I'm talking about metabolic adaptations that occur while you're exercising. So as we know, when you're training, you want to elicit an mTOR response, or mammalian rapamycin. This basically just means you're going to be eliciting a higher protein synthesis. For those that don't know what protein synthesis, the role of that is in terms of training, you want to have a higher protein synthesis adaptation while you're training to lead to a larger increase in muscle growth. It's been proposed that blood flow restriction training leads to an increase in growth hormone, but at the same time, we know that acutely increasing growth hormone, or any anabolic that is endogenous in the body, so basically created within, is not really going to elicit some sort of change long term. Because you're having this metabolic adaptation, it's going to lead to an increase in reactive oxygen species, which in layman's terms basically means you're going to be increasing some sort of acute inflammation to the cell itself. It leads to an increase in cell swelling. Cell swelling, as we know, leads to an increased hypertrophic response. So these two are kind of coincided together. Having an increased hypertrophy and increased cell swelling metabolic response, it can be advantageous. Guys, the next thing we want to talk about is the when. When would you use this style of training? When would you want to use this style of training? So as we've already alluded to, if you're injured, it could be an advantageous way to kind of deal with that nagging injury or rehab it on your own without having to go through a PT or physio or chiro or something along those lines, if it's something that's within a range of motion error, overuse error, or something along those lines. At the same time, it's not always possible to just consistently increase the load. For example, what benefit is there in doing dumbbell curls with like 100 pounds? Next, catching a pump. As we know, Arnold was big on catching pumps. If you're watching this video, you're probably big on catching a pump. But here's the thing, catching a pump is a lot more than just getting swole. Even though swole is the goal and size is the prize, there's a little bit more to it than that. If you're catching a pump, that means you're having cell swelling. That means you're having all these metabolic changes. You're going to be leading to an acute level of hormonal change. You're going to be leading to an AMPK response. You're going to be leading to an increased mTOR response, which is going to lead to an increase in protein synthesis. All of these little cascades of changes add up. One more thing on catching a pump, guys. Catching a pump is generally related to an accumulation of lactic acid. So lactic acid, as we know, is a byproduct of some sort of metabolic change within the body. Typically, it's not possible to have a high bout of lactic acid in single joint exercises, which will lead to a longer duration or hormonal change. So doing this form of blood flow restriction training can be advantageous. At the same time, we know that through cell swelling, it will lead to a change in the actual cell itself. But how's it doing that? It's based on the extra and intracellular matrix, so basically the fluids in the cell and outside of the cell. By having it swell, it leads to a change in that, which causes more anabolism, so basically the muscle will grow. So catching a pump can mean that you're getting swole. It can mean you're becoming the goal, and it can mean size becomes the prize. All right, guys, so next we want to talk about the benefits of this style of training. And as I'm sure you can guess based on everything that we discussed so far, metabolite accumulation is kind of one of the largest precursors to this style of training. If you're having the lactic acid formation, the cell swelling, the growth hormone responses, even though it's acute, the hormonal changes, the anabolistic responses, then theoretically it will allow you to grow based on hypertrophy and endurance. At the same time, you get to train at a decreased training intensity. The volume is still equated to being the same and is still high, but the overall intensity can be decreased. All right, guys, so next we want to talk about drawbacks or potential side effects of using this style of training, or the research based on the training. So the board, we basically have here occlusion of the artery. So if you're not using the Katsu band, or you're not using some sort of band that actually monitors blood flow in and out of the muscle fiber and tissue in and of itself, there's potential that you could be blocking the artery, which is not what you want. The purpose of this style of training is to increase as much blood flow to the muscle as possible, so it causes a pooling and it causes all these extracellular responses to happen to the cell itself. But you don't want a ton of the blood coming back out. So basically you're just blocking the veins. At the same time, it may not actually be doing anything special at all. Even though it all sounds very good and fancy based on this metabolic changes in the metabolite buildups, if you're following general principles of progressive overload and the specificity principles, and you're adhering to all the general principles of strength and conditioning, you may not actually need to actually use this style of training, especially if you're not injured and you have good range of motion. Finally, a lot of the literature on this topic typically uses untrained populations or individuals that have been training for around a year to a year and a half. We know based on this that people who are untrained are going to have a response because something is better than nothing. The same can kind of be true with people who have been training for about a year to a year and a half. All right, guys, from here we're going to talk about the fun and the juicy details that is associated with this style of training. So the first thing we need to talk about is how heavy you're going to be lifting. Typically, you're going to be under the 50% range, but I have seen literature that is within the 60% and under range, and as low as 20%. So that's substantially lower than a 70% range or an RP of like 7 that most individuals would be training in. Next, we want to talk about the reps. So reps vary from about 15 to 30. You can find several protocols all over the internet. Everybody's got their ways to go about how to do this style of training. Same with the literature, it's all over the place. But one thing that has been kind of the consensus is higher volume with shorter rests. So 15 to 30 rep range and a rest that is usually under 90 seconds. The average that a lot of the literature shows in a rehab as well as performance-based setting is typically around 2 to 3 times a week. Next, we want to talk about wrapping. So I've already discussed that you want to be around an RP of 6 to 7 if you want to call it that. So basically the band should feel tight, but it is not cutting off blood flow entirely. Make sure that when you're actually wrapping, it is a consistent wrap over the same area. You're not spiraling it all over the entire limb because of the potential to cover up the artery. I believe that this style of training can be advantageous if your goal is to increase muscle hypertrophy and muscle endurance. It can be advantageous if you have a nagging injury and you can't lift heavy, or you can't progressively overload, or you're looking for a way to increase some sort of inflammation acutely to that area that's bothering you as a way to basically signal to the body, hey, something's injured, let's fix it, let's get to work. At the same time, it should not be used in place of general strength and conditioning principles or general hypertrophy principles if your goal is size and strength. So, as a take-home message, yes, this style of training can be good, I believe it should be sprinkled in every once in a while. No, I don't think you should be doing it consistently and all the time. All right, ladies and gents, that's all I've got to say on this one. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it hasn't been too long. Like, comment, and as always, please subscribe. Stay strong. We'll see you in the next one. Thank you. Good night.